Babylon is usually remembered for its towering brick walls and lush hanging gardens. But the city's true foundation was not stone. It was a mountain of debt recorded on sun-baked clay. Long before the first modern banks emerged, a single family known as the House of Egibi executed a silent coup, turning the Mesopotamian economy into a private subsidiary of their own ledger. They did not need armies to conquer the empire when they could simply buy the titles to the land the empire stood upon. This was the birth of the first private financial machine, a forensic audit of a civilization's future conducted by men who understood that he who controls the liquidity controls the king. While Nebuchadnezzar II expanded his borders with blood, the Egibi expanded their balance sheet with ink, effectively collateralizing the throne itself. But as their private wealth began to eclipse the state's own solvency, a dangerous friction emerged between the power of the sword and the power of the interest rate. The execution of this takeover was clinical, the mathematics were predatory, and the resulting systemic risk was about to push the world's first billionaires toward a terminal liquidation. The physical majesty of the Ishtar Gate served as a distraction for the masses, masking the reality that the city's true architecture was composed of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. These tablets were not mere records of history. They were the first sophisticated securitized assets, representing a total financialization of Babylonian life. The House of Egibi operated as the central nervous system of this system, functioning as a shadow treasury that existed outside the traditional temple economy. By standardizing the value of silver against agricultural output, they created a predictable environment for high-stakes arbitrage. They realized that land was finite, but debt could be expanded indefinitely as long as the borrower remained productive. This realization allowed them to infiltrate every layer of the social hierarchy, from the street merchant to the high priest. However, their true genius lay in how they managed to decouple wealth from physical labor, turning time itself into a billable commodity. While the Babylonian state relied on the extraction of tribute through brute force, the Egibi family focused on the acquisition of productive infrastructure and the management of trade routes. They positioned themselves as the ultimate intermediaries, providing the necessary capital for ventures that the state's rigid bureaucracy was too slow to support. This agility allowed them to capture the market for high-interest loans, effectively taxing the growth of the empire without the need for a standing army. Every transaction they facilitated added a new layer of complexity to their ledger, making their presence indispensable to the city's economic survival. They were not just lenders. They were the first asset managers, diversifying their holdings across real estate, commodities, and human capital. This diversification provided a hedge against the volatile shifts in royal favor and regional conflict. But as they consolidated their grip on the city's resources, they began to eye a far more ambitious prize: the absolute financial dependency of the crown. The rise of the Egibi represents a case study in how private equity can effectively hollow out a sovereign state from the inside out. They understood that a king's power is only as stable as his ability to pay his soldiers and fund his monumental building projects. By inserting themselves into the flow of capital, they ensured that the throne could not function without their constant infusion of liquidity. This created a symbiotic relationship where the state provided the legal framework for the bank's operations, while the bank provided the silver that kept the state solvent. Yet, this partnership was never one of equals. It was a slow-motion acquisition of the empire's future. The question was no longer whether the king ruled Babylon, but rather who owned the debt that the king had incurred to maintain his image. This hidden hierarchy would eventually force the empire into a corner where the only way out was a total surrender of its economic sovereignty. The mechanics of this financial takeover began with the clay tablet, a seemingly humble medium that functioned as the world's first Layer 2 financial instrument. Unlike physical silver, which was heavy and dangerous to transport, these tablets represented a contractual promise that could be traded, discounted, and used as collateral. The Egibi perfected the use of these instruments to create a private liquidity market that bypassed the cumbersome temple silos. Each tablet was a binding legal claim, baked in the sun to ensure it could not be altered without leaving a forensic trail of evidence. By standardizing these contracts, they effectively created a form of paper money long before the invention of the printing press. This allowed them to move value across vast distances and through various hands without the underlying assets ever leaving their control. But the true power of the mud standard lay in its ability to institutionalize a debt trap that few could ever hope to escape. At the heart of the Egibi's profit model was a standard interest rate of 20%, a figure that functioned as a structural ceiling for the average borrower. In an agrarian economy, where crop yields were subject to the whims of the weather, such a high rate of return was mathematically unsustainable for the working class. This was not an oversight by the bank. It was a deliberate strategy to trigger a cycle of perpetual refinancing and asset forfeiture. When a farmer or a merchant could not meet their obligations, the Egibi did not simply seize their property. They restructured the debt to include even more collateral. This turned the bank into the largest landowner in the region, as they systematically converted defaulted loans into tangible real estate holdings. They were effectively shorting the survival of the middle class to build a massive portfolio of income-producing assets. This predatory lending practice ensured that the bank's balance sheet grew even during periods of economic contraction. Historically, the temples had held a monopoly on the distribution of grain and the management of the economy, acting as the primary creditors to the populace. The House of Egibi disrupted this ancient order by offering a more flexible and aggressive alternative to the state-sanctioned religious institutions. They operated with a level of speed and secrecy that the public temples could not match, allowing them to capture the most lucrative opportunities in the private sector. By focusing on the commercial class rather than the peasantry, they built a network of high-net-worth clients who were beholden to their capital. This created a parallel economy that operated outside the direct control of the king as tax collectors and the high priests. The Egibi were not just competing for market share. They were creating an entirely new financial ecosystem that prioritized private profit over social stability. This shift in the flow of capital began to erode the traditional foundations of Babylonian authority. Liquidity is the ultimate weapon in a closed economy, and the Egibi controlled the supply of silver with a precision that was terrifyingly modern. They understood that by restricting the flow of currency, they could force their competitors into insolvency and then acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar. This practice of artificial scarcity allowed them to dictate terms to both the merchant guilds and the local administration. Their archives reveal a sophisticated understanding of market cycles, showing how they would hoard silver during periods of high demand to drive up interest rates. This was a clinical application of economic leverage designed to maximize their returns at the expense of the city's overall health. Every tablet they baked was a new link in a chain that bound the economy to their private interests. As their influence grew, they realized that the ultimate borrower was not the merchant or the farmer, but the sovereign himself. The transition from private lending to state-level financing was the final step in the Egibi's plan to achieve total market dominance. They had already mastered the art of collateralizing individual lives and family estates, but now they sought to collateralize the entire apparatus of the Babylonian government. By positioning themselves as the primary source of funding for the king's ambitions, they were preparing to execute a sovereign mortgage. This was no longer about simple interest. It was about the acquisition of the empire's tax, farming rights, and its strategic infrastructure. The bank was moving from the shadows of the marketplace into the inner sanctum of the royal palace. They were about to prove that a family of bankers could hold a higher rank than a king, provided they held the titles to his throne. The stage was set for a financial confrontation that would determine the fate of the most powerful empire on earth. When Nebuchadnezzar II ascended to the throne, he inherited an empire that was militarily dominant but financially overextended. His massive building programs and constant military campaigns required a level of liquidity that the traditional tax system could not provide in a timely manner. The House of Egibi stepped into this vacuum, offering the crown a series of massive bridge loans to cover the immediate costs of imperial expansion. These loans were not granted out of loyalty to the state, but as a calculated investment in the empire's future tax revenue. In exchange for the silver needed to pay his legions, the king granted the Egibi the right to collect taxes from specific provinces and industries. This effectively turned the bank into a private tax collection agency, with the full backing of the Babylonian military. The king had a short-term funding, but he had traded away the long-term fiscal independence of his government. As the Egibi's involvement in state finances deepened, they became too big to fail in the most literal sense of the term. If the bank were to collapse, the entire Babylonian economy would have seized up, leading to immediate civil unrest and the potential overthrow of the monarchy. This systemic importance gave the family an unprecedented level of immunity from royal interference or legal repercussions. They could dictate policy changes that favored their commercial interests, knowing that the king could not afford to alienate his primary creditors. The bank's ledgers became the true record of the empire's strength, often showing a more accurate picture of reality than the king's own proclamations. They were managing the sovereign's debt with the same cold efficiency they applied to a local grain merchant's mortgage. This relationship created a moral hazard where the bank was incentivized to encourage the king's most expensive and risky ambitions. The acquisition of tax farming rights allowed the Egibi to integrate themselves into the very fabric of the Babylonian administration. They were no longer just passive lenders. They were now active managers of the empire's resource distribution and logistical networks. By controlling the collection of taxes in kind, such as grain, dates, and livestock, they gained a monopoly over the city's food supply. This gave them the power to manipulate prices and ensure that their own warehouses were always full while their competitors struggled with shortages. They also used their influence to secure contracts for the maintenance of canals and roads, further entrenching their control over the infrastructure of trade. Every aspect of Babylonian life now required an interaction with the Egibi's financial machine, whether the citizens realized it or not. The bank had successfully turned the functions of the state into a series of high-margin revenue streams for their private shareholders. The Egibi also recognized that the empire's military was its most expensive asset and its greatest liability. They began to provide financing for specific military campaigns, essentially betting on the success of Babylonian conquest to generate new sources of plunder and tribute. This turned the bank into a silent partner in the empire's wars, with a direct stake in the expansion of the borders. They were not interested in the glory of victory, but in the liquidation of the defeated nation's assets to repay their loans. This created a dangerous incentive for the bank to push for constant conflict, as war was the fastest way to generate the massive returns they required. The soldiers may have fought for the king, but they were ultimately working to satisfy the interest obligations of the House of Egibi. This dynamic ensured that the bank would continue to profit as long as the empire continued to expand. Despite their immense power, the Egibi were acutely aware of the sovereign risk inherent in lending to an absolute monarch. A king could, in theory, decide to cancel all debts or seize the bank's assets by force if he felt his authority was being challenged. To mitigate this risk, the family diversified their holdings across different regions and invested heavily in political influence within the royal court. They placed their agents in key administrative positions to ensure that any move against the bank would be detected and neutralized before it could gain momentum. They also maintained a complex web of international trade connections that allowed them to move their mobile assets beyond the reach of the Babylonian authorities. This strategy of geographical and political hedging made them almost impossible to dismantle through traditional means. However, They were about to discover that even the most sophisticated financial machine has a breaking point when faced with a shift in global power. The House of Egibi had successfully mortgaged the Babylonian Empire, turning the sovereign himself into a high-interest client. They held the deeds to the land, the rights to the taxes, and the keys to the grain silos that fed the population. But as the shadows of a new power began to stretch across the horizon from the east, the bank's ultimate gamble was about to be tested. The Persians were not interested in the nuances of Babylonian finance or the complex web of debt the Egibi had woven. A new kind of conqueror was approaching, one who viewed the bank not as a necessary partner, but as a rival for the soul of the empire. The Egibi's mountain of clay was about to meet the heat of a Persian fire that cared nothing for the sanctity of a ledger. The world's first financial superpower was about to face its first terminal audit, and the cost of failure would be the total erasure of their invisible empire. But simple lending was only the first phase of their corporate expansion. The family was now moving to seize the actual infrastructure of the state. They realized that interest is a powerful tool, but owning the means of production is absolute. This was the transition from being the empire's creditors to becoming its shadow administrators, a pivot that would turn every bite of bread in Babylon into a dividend for the bank. But as they integrated themselves into the physical hardware of the city, they were also building a backdoor exit, a global network of assets that no king could touch. The bank was no longer just part of the economy. It was becoming the economy itself, and the board of directors was ready to diversify into the darkest corners of the ancient market. The family understood that control over the caloric intake of the city was the ultimate hedge against inflation and social unrest. By acquiring the physical grain silos of Babylon, the Egibi effectively became the gatekeepers of the empire's most vital commodity. They did not just store grain. They managed the supply chain to ensure that prices remained favorable to their own balance sheets. This vertical integration allowed them to profit from the harvest, the storage, and the eventual distribution to the urban masses. Every bushel of barley was tracked with the same forensic precision as a silver loan, turning the food supply into a securitized asset. This was not a public service provided by the state, but a private monopoly designed to extract maximum value from the city's basic needs. However, their control over the food supply was merely a platform for a much more ambitious takeover of the city's physical footprint. Urban real estate in Babylon was the most valuable asset class in the ancient world, and the Egibi were the primary architects of its consolidation. They systematically acquired prime, residential, and commercial properties, often through the strategic use of predatory foreclosure on defaulted loans. By the middle of the 6th century, the family owned vast swaths of the city's interior, turning the capital into a high-yield rental portfolio. This allowed them to influence the development of the city, ensuring that infrastructure projects always increased the value of their own holdings. They were no longer just financiers. They were the city's most powerful landlords, collecting rent from the very people who built the empire. This steady stream of rental income provided the bank with a level of cash flow that was independent of the volatile interest rates of the lending market. Yet, even as they built their urban empire, they were eyeing the massive irrigation networks that made the desert bloom. The irrigation canals of Mesopotamia were the lifeblood of the civilization, and the Egibi viewed their maintenance as a lucrative infrastructure play. They secured contracts from the crown to manage the dredging and repair of these vital waterways, effectively privatizing the empire's most essential utility. This gave them the power to decide which fields received water and which were left to wither, a leverage they used to force independent farmers into unfavorable debt agreements. By controlling the water, they controlled the yields, and by controlling the yields, they controlled the entire agricultural economy. This was a classic example of infrastructure management being used as a tool for hostile corporate expansion. They were turning a public necessity into a private toll road, where every drop of water carried a hidden fee for the bank. But this control over the land was only half of the equation, as the bank began to look toward the lucrative business of international trade. International trade routes were the high-speed data cables of the ancient world, and the Egibi were determined to dominate the flow of information and goods. They established a network of agents in distant cities like Susa, Tyre, and Jerusalem, creating a cross-border financial system that operated beyond the reach of any single king. This allowed them to engage in sophisticated asset arbitrage, buying commodities where they were cheap and selling them where they were scarce. They used their internal ledger to settle accounts between distant branches, effectively inventing the first international wire transfer system. This global reach provided a vital hedge against the localized political instability that often plagued the Babylonian throne. By diversifying their interests across multiple jurisdictions, they ensured that the bank would survive even if the city itself were to fall. However, this global expansion required a massive and mobile workforce that the bank would manage with clinical coldness. In the eyes of the House of Egibi, human beings were not individuals but liquid assets that could be bought, sold, and depreciated on a ledger. They became major players in the management of human capital, treating slave labor as a versatile commodity that could be deployed across their various business interests. Slaves were leased out to construction projects, used to man the oars of trade ships, or put to work in the family's vast agricultural estates. The bank developed a sophisticated system for tracking the productivity and value of these individuals, ensuring that every unit of labor generated a predictable return on investment. This was the ultimate form of asset management, where the very lives of the workers were collateralized against the bank as future earnings. By turning human existence into a line item, the Egibi achieved a level of economic efficiency that was as terrifying as it was profitable. But even this total control over labor was not enough to satisfy their hunger for absolute market dominance. The family's diversification strategy was a masterclass in risk mitigation, designed to protect their wealth from the inevitable cycles of imperial collapse. They understood that while empires are temporary, the demand for capital and commodities is eternal. By shifting their wealth into mobile assets like silver, precious gems, and international trade contracts, they prepared for the day when the Babylonian state might no longer be a safe harbor. They were effectively building a shadow treasury that could be liquidated and moved at a moment's notice. This offshore strategy allowed them to maintain their influence even as the political climate in Babylon became increasingly toxic. They were no longer loyal to a king or a country. They were loyal only to the continued growth of their own balance sheet. This lack of national allegiance made them a dangerous wild card in the high-stakes game of ancient geopolitics. To further insulate themselves from market volatility, the Egibi sought to establish absolute commodity monopolies over key goods like wool, oil, and dates. They used their vast reserves of silver to corner the market during times of abundance, only to release their stocks when prices reached their peak. This practice of market manipulation allowed them to extract enormous profits from both the producers and the consumers. They were the first to understand that a monopoly is not just about size, but about the ability to dictate the terms of trade across an entire industry. This strategy of horizontal integration complemented their control over the physical infrastructure, creating a closed loop where the bank profited at every stage of the economic process. No merchant could compete with the sheer scale and clinical efficiency of the Egibi's commercial operations. Yet, this total dominance was beginning to attract the unwanted attention of those who still believed in the absolute power of the throne. The bank's role as shadow administrators eventually extended into the very heart of the royal court as financial planning. The king's treasurers were often trained by the Egibi or were themselves former employees of the bank, ensuring that the family's interests were always represented in the halls of power. This regulatory capture meant that any new laws or taxes were vetted by the bank before they were ever enacted. They had successfully infiltrated the state's decision-making apparatus, turning the government into a subsidiary of their private financial machine. The distinction between public policy and private profit had been completely erased, leaving the empire's citizens at the mercy of a ledger they could not read. This was the final stage of the hostile takeover, where the bank did not just influence the state, but actually functioned as the state's brain. But even the most brilliant shadow administration cannot account for the unpredictable nature of a conqueror who does not play by the rules of the market. The Egibi's ability to provide international liquidity made them indispensable to the various vassal states that surrounded the Babylonian core. They acted as a neutral clearinghouse for trade between rival kingdoms, profiting from the friction of cross-border commerce. This international influence gave them a level of diplomatic power that rivaled the king's own ambassadors. They could effectively freeze the economy of a neighboring state by withholding credit or calling in outstanding loans. This financial warfare was far more subtle and effective than a military blockade, allowing the bank to shape the geopolitical landscape to suit its needs. They were the architects of a new world order based on the flow of capital rather than the march of armies. This global reach made the House of Egibi the first truly multinational corporation, a leviathan that bestrode the ancient world. But as their shadow grew longer, the light of the Babylonian sun was beginning to fade. As the 6th century progressed, the bank's focus shifted toward the ultimate preservation of their assets in the face of an impending regime change. They began to pull back from long-term infrastructure projects and focus more on highly liquid, portable wealth that could survive a total social collapse. This tactical retreat was a clear signal to those who knew how to read the market that the end of the Babylonian era was near. The Egibi were no longer investing in the future of the city. They were preparing for its liquidation. They had extracted everything they could from the ruins of the empire and were now looking for a way to carry their gains into the next era of history. The bank was ready to abandon the king they had bought, leaving him to face the coming storm alone. But the final audit of the House of Egibi would not be conducted by a banker or a king, but by a force of nature that cared nothing for their carefully balanced ledgers. The sheer scale of the Egibi's financial machine had made them the most powerful entity in the world, but it had also made them the most visible target for the rising Persian tide. While the bank had successfully hedged against every predictable market risk, they had failed to account for a conqueror who viewed their very existence as a threat to the divine order. Cyrus the Great was not looking for a loan. He was looking for a total reset of the global power structure that would render their clay archives obsolete. The Egibi's diversification, their monopolies, and their shadow administration were all about to be tested by a force that operated entirely outside the logic of the interest rate. As the Persian armies closed in on the city's walls, the bankers realized that their mountain of clay tablets might not be a fortress, but a tomb. The ultimate liquidation was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a mathematical certainty that would either cement their legacy or bury it forever in the dust of history. The House of Egibi had spent 2 centuries building a financial fortress that seemed impervious to the whims of local kings, but they were about to hit the sovereign ceiling of the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great had entered Babylon as a liberator. Yet his successors viewed the bank's mountain of clay tablets as a competing center of power that could not be allowed to exist. This was the moment where the power of the ledger met the absolute will of a god-king who did not recognize the sanctity of private contracts. The bankers had successfully hedged against market volatility, but they had no defense against a sovereign who was willing to burn the entire market to the ground to maintain control. The final audit was no longer a matter of silver and interest, but a brutal confrontation between the world's first billionaires and the ultimate regulatory authority of the ancient world. When Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon in 539 BC, the House of Egibi did not face immediate destruction, but rather a temporary period of strategic alignment. The Persian administration realized that the bank's infrastructure was essential for maintaining the stability of the newly conquered province. For several decades, the family continued to manage the tax farming operations and provide the liquidity necessary for the Persian military machine to function. They were essentially serving as the outsourced treasury for the largest empire the world had ever seen, a position that brought them to the pinnacle of their wealth. However, this partnership was built on a foundation of mutual suspicion rather than genuine cooperation. The Persians were beginning to realize that the Egibi's control over the grain supply and real estate markets made them a state within a state. This realization would eventually turn a useful financial tool into a target for systemic erasure. The primary conflict between the bank and the Persian crown stemmed from the fundamental difference between commercial law and the divine right of kings. The House of Egibi operated on the principle that a contract was an absolute obligation that even a ruler must respect to ensure economic stability. Conversely, the Persian monarchs viewed their own will as the ultimate source of law, making any private entity with comparable influence a direct challenge to their authority. As the bank's ledgers grew to encompass the debts of the Persian satraps and high-ranking officials, the family became a liability to the crown's absolute control. They were effectively holding the empire's administrative class hostage through a web of interest-bearing obligations and collateralized assets. This created a level of sovereign risk that the later Persian kings, particularly Xerxes I, found entirely intolerable. Xerxes I ascended to the throne with a mandate to centralize power and crush any potential sources of internal autonomy. He viewed the Babylonian banking families not as pillars of the economy, but as predatory entities that drained the wealth of the empire into private coffers. The bank's ability to move capital across borders and influence trade routes was seen as a form of financial espionage that compromised Persian security. Xerxes understood that as long as the Egibi controlled the liquidity of the region, the Persian state would never have total mastery over its own resources. He began a systematic campaign to undermine the bank's legal standing, challenging their titles to land and their rights to collect taxes. This was the beginning of a regulatory liquidation designed to strip the family of their institutional power before the final blow was struck. The tension reached a breaking point during the Babylonian revolts of 484 BC, when the city attempted to throw off the Persian yoke. While the historical record is silent on the bank's direct involvement, their financial interests were inextricably linked to the success of a local administration. Xerxes used the chaos of the uprising as a convenient pretext to execute a total asset seizure against the city's leading merchant and banking houses. He realized that the only way to truly conquer Babylon was to destroy the financial records that gave the elite their power over the populace. By targeting the clay archives, the Persian military was performing a forensic purge of the city's economic memory. The destruction of these records was a calculated act of state-sponsored insolvency that wiped out centuries of private wealth in a single stroke. The physical destruction of the House of Egibi's archive was a terminal event that signaled the end of the world's first private central bank. Persian soldiers entered the family's villas and storage facilities, systematically smashing the sun-baked clay tablets that held the evidence of a trillion-dollar empire. These broken fragments were then used as rubble for construction projects or dumped into the foundations of new buildings, effectively burying the family's legacy. Without their tablets, the Egibi had no legal claim to their vast real estate holdings, their grain silos, or their outstanding loans. The entire financial machine was liquidated not through a market crash, but through the brute force of a sovereign who refused to be a debtor. This was the ultimate demonstration of how quickly private capital can vanish when it loses the protection of the state's legal framework. Following the destruction of their archives, the House of Egibi vanished from the historical record with a speed that suggests a total, systemic collapse. There are no further mentions of their business dealings, their political influence, or their once vast estates in the subsequent Persian or Greek accounts. It is likely that the family members were either executed, exiled, or forced into a state of permanent insolvency as their assets were absorbed by the Persian treasury. The wealth that had been accumulated over 5 generations was redistributed to satisfy the crown's own debts and to fund its ongoing military campaigns. This total erasure of a financial dynasty serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of wealth that is built on the precarious foundation of political favor. The bank that once owned a king had been reduced to a pile of nameless dust and broken pottery. Although the House of Egibi was physically liquidated, their mathematical innovations and financial structures survived the fires of the Persian conquest. The concepts of securitized debt, compound interest, and the use of contracts as liquid assets were eventually adopted by the Greeks and Romans. These ancient bankers had laid the groundwork for the modern global financial system, proving that capital could be managed as a cold, abstract force. Their forensic legacy is found in every modern ledger and every digital transaction that moves wealth across the globe today. We are still living in the world that the Egibi envisioned, a world where time is a commodity and debt is the primary engine of human productivity. The destruction of their physical archive could not stop the spread of the predatory logic that they had perfected in the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. The story of the Egibi is not a cautionary tale of ancient history, but a forensic blueprint for the current relationship between private equity and the state. Today's global financial institutions operate with the same disregard for national borders and the same focus on infrastructure management that the Egibi pioneered. They have successfully collateralized the future of entire nations, turning the sovereign debt market into a private revenue stream for a new class of billionaires. The tension between the power of the interest rate and the power of the government remains the primary fault line in the modern global economy. We are seeing a repeat of the Babylonian banking coup, where the control of liquidity has become the ultimate source of political authority. The only difference is that our modern tablets are made of silicon rather than clay, making them far more difficult for a sovereign to smash. When a financial system becomes too complex and its debt burdens become unsustainable, history suggests that a systemic reboot is the only eventual outcome. The Persian liquidation of the Egibi was a crude but effective way to clear the empire's balance sheet and reassert the dominance of the state over private capital. It was a recognition that no society can function indefinitely when its primary resources are owned by a single family of creditors. This cycle of expansion, financialization, and eventual liquidation has repeated itself throughout the centuries, from the fall of the Templars to the modern banking crises. Each time, the bankers believe they have built a fortress that is too big to fail, only to find that the state is the only entity with a monopoly on violence. The House of Egibi learned this lesson at the cost of their entire existence, leaving behind only the broken shards of their ambition. The true power of the Babylonian banking coup was not the silver they hoarded, but the way they changed the human perception of value and obligation. They proved that a civilization could be managed as a series of high-yield assets, a realization that has been the driving force of economic history ever since. While the names of the Egibi family have been forgotten by most, their financial machine continues to hum in the background of every modern city. We are all participants in a system that was designed to turn our labor into a dividend for an invisible creditor. The walls of Babylon may have fallen, but the invisible walls of debt that the Egibi constructed still define the boundaries of our world. Their survival is not found in their bloodline, but in the relentless, clinical mathematics of the interest rate that governs our lives. The history of the House of Egibi is a forensic audit of the moment when money became more powerful than the sword, if only for a few centuries. It reveals the inherent instability of a society where private profit is allowed to cannibalize public infrastructure and sovereign authority. The final liquidation of their bank was not a tragedy, but a necessary correction for an empire that had lost control of its own economic survival. As we look at the rising power of modern financial leviathans, we must ask if we are approaching a similar sovereign ceiling. The lessons of the clay tablets are as relevant today as they were in the time of Xerxes, warning us of the dangers of a world where the ledger is the only law. History shows that when the bankers finally own everything, the only thing left for the state to do is to break the bank. The House of Egibi provides the ultimate proof that the most effective way to conquer a nation is not through its gates, but through its balance sheet. They were the first to understand that the true currency of power is not gold, but the control of the future through the management of debt. Their rise was clinical, their dominance was absolute, and their fall was a violent reminder of the limits of private wealth. As the dust settles on the ruins of Babylon, we can see the outlines of our own financial architecture reflected in the broken clay of their archives. The bank may have been liquidated, but the machine they built has simply moved to a new set of ledgers. The sword may forge an empire, but only the ledger has the power to own it forever.